Hey everyone, Emna from Veamly is joining me today to talk about remote work, culture, and process optimization. I'm Darren with GitLab. So Emna, thanks so much for making the time today, and feel free to verbalize your first question.
Thank you, Darren. I'm really excited to be here. And one of the first things I would love to talk about is cultural reinforcement in remote, because that's one of the hardest challenges definitely remote teams face, especially us, like being a young company. Like it's very hard like to start talking about remote when you're just few people versus when you have the resources as a big company to do so. So yeah.
So the question is, what would I recommend for cultural reinforcement in
Yes,
remote teams? Is that right?
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yep.
it's a fair point on size making a difference. GitLab, we're at almost 1,000 people now, over 60 countries. So definitely not a tiny company by any means anymore. And we have implemented a discretionary bonus where employees can actually recommend other employees to get a bonus for living out the values of the company. And so at scale, this is really awesome because we're too big to know what everyone is doing at any given time. But by having this discretionary bonus, when we get on a company call and it's in the company call document, we can see what team members have been nominated for and received a discretionary bonus, as well as a transcript on what they did to live out some of those values. So it's a constant reminder of people giving kudos and saying thanks and being awarded for living out the values. And so as a company, when you see that all the time, it reminds you, oh yeah, these values are available. They are real, living, breathing things. They need to be a part of my day-to-day. And that helps reinforce it. On a smaller scale, if the actual financial bonus isn't feasible, I think that concept still applies. People really like being patted on the back. People like other colleagues noticing and paying attention when they do something well. And so it can start even as small as a thanks or a kudos channel within Slack or your communication channel of choice, where we have a whole channel dedicated to thank yous that solely exist for other people to thank other people for helping them out or going above and beyond or living out a particular value. And we really encourage people to call out what value was exemplified in whatever they did. And that helps reinforce the realness of the values. One thing I've seen is values can kind of diminish over time or become writing on a wall as a company scales, unless you are intentional about making it a part of the fabric of saying thank you to other employees. Another thing that I think is important is being intentional about informal communication. We actually have a handbook page within our all remote section that talks about this. In a co-located company, a lot of the informal cultural reinforcements happen just because you're in the same building. So people are naturally in the same space, they'll overhear certain things, or they'll see someone doing something for someone, helping someone out, maybe going outside of their department to help with a project, that kind of thing. When everyone works from anywhere and no one's in the same office, you don't have eyes on things like that. And so we set up coffee chats, we set up team social calls, smaller company calls within certain departments, and we make an agenda item in each of these just to talk about overall health or kudos or things like that. So we dedicate time in a work call to talk about things related to culture and saying thanks. And in co-located companies, you might get away with not having to do that. But in a remote company, it goes a long way as making that a part of the work.
I think one of the things for us, what we've seen is that you guys talk about this as well in one of your pages, being a difference between being an all remote companies and a remote first company. And I'd consider us a remote first company. And what we do personally, like being a tiny company from day one, even if we're co-located sometimes, we put these practices at this stage as mandatory. Like as we grow, we see them as optional, but like so they become habits. But what we do, for example, is like every Monday we get all on a Zoom call and we do Gratitude Monday. And that's the moment where everybody shares what they're grateful for. And it doesn't have to be work related, right? Like the idea is like live by gratitude, like really learn how to embrace it. And you know, like some Mondays, you know, like sometimes you just had a bad weekend or just woke up on the wrong foot. And for me, what I try to really push my team to do is to really take a moment to pause and try to really feel it, because we see the difference, right? To remember what we're grateful for. And sometimes you hear people talk about their moms or their teammates or, you know, like or a bug they got rid of, or like, it doesn't matter, but like it varies. And Another thing that we do is we do meditation Wednesdays. So on Wednesdays, we get on a Zoom call and we do breathing exercises, and then everybody shares what they're stressed about and what they're looking forward to. And the idea is like, it's okay to be stressed, not saying like that's not going to happen because we're humans, but how can you balance that stress? So how can you help, make sure that everybody has visibility about other people's also stresses and create that empathy even more, because that empathy is also a core value of our company. And I think it's also a very core value to remote in general, because when you're not seeing what's going on with people next to you, you can't really empathize with them. So that's a moment for us to do that. And then the final thing we do is we do our all company meeting for now, like that we'd see eventually grow. Obviously, as we grow as a team, it becomes like, small all companies between all team meetings becomes weekly one. We definitely are very transparent, right? We have a process, like we have a company board, and then by department, we share what's happening, like the top 3 things. But then we do learning time because we are a continuous learning organization. We believe in that. And so every time one person on the team would teach for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, like the whole rest of the team, something about what they're doing, whether it's growth, whether it's marketing, whether it's fundraising, whether it's like something technical, software architecture, whatever it is. And it's really powerful. Like you think 15 minutes cannot make the change, but it creates the bonding between the teammates. And these are like, for us, like things that you don't have to have resources as a company or money to be able to implement these things. And we end on social time. And social time could be like somebody playing the ukulele and we joke about it, all of us, or something more structured, like, one of the few early social times I remember, our people operation managers made us all take the Myers-Briggs test, the personality test. And then we created avatars for each person. She created, actually. And then we played a guessing game on who is who. And it was so powerful because everybody had assumptions, right? And stereotypes about every other person, right? So thinking, oh yeah, that's probably the extroverted one versus they're not. It's just like in their role, they can show extroversion, but they're not an extroverted person. And like, judging the communication skills of others, things like that. And I think these small practices are super powerful for young, remote or first companies like ours anyway. So I would just like, want to share in that sense to see the difference between, a big company at 1,000 people company and a tiny company in that sense.
I
So, yeah.
love that. I love that. There's so much to unpack there. As you're saying that, my mind is running. I'm actually going to create a merge request to expand upon that on some of our handbook pages, because you're right. None of that cost money. It just requires leadership being intentional about making it a part of the fabric of the company. And honestly, putting gratitude and empathy at the heart of what you're doing, I think that so easily gets lost at scale, where it's so easy to say that whatever the crisis of the day is more important than the 15 minutes of gratitude or the 15 minutes of meditation where you talk about things that are stressing you or that are causing you anxiety. Being open and transparent about that as a team is it's core for co-located teams, but in remote teams, I think it has an outsized positive effect because people are in their own universe. And so if something is really weighing them down, it can really feel a lot heavier than it is because they don't know where to turn. They can't just look somewhere in the office and find somebody to sympathize with them or empathize with them. And so providing an avenue from that, from the top down, from leadership that says, it's okay for you to vocalize and verbalize these things. We want you to be healthy and strong as a team, is huge. And that's culture in a nutshell. When people have each other's back, that creates culture.
Absolutely.
And when there's a sense that people don't have their backs, that's when culture starts to degrade and dysfunction starts to creep in. And I'll say one other thing. We actually try to do our best in onboarding to make it an essential part of onboarding, like an actual work task to go through some of the things that we believe in from a values and culture standpoint and really spend the time ingesting them. And if you have questions about them, there are people to reach out to. Because if you don't do it at onboarding, it's really hard to catch up. It's kind of like your first impression of the company, how they're going to bring you in, what foundation they're going to lay for you. It carries through. So it's really important to think about this if you're a small company early on and get it right with your first employees, because they will then set the tone for everyone that comes after them.
It's so true. And it's so funny because like for us, we discovered the GitLab handbook along the way. Like when we just started with our own, experiences in that sense. And we realized how much a lot of the things you did, guys, great. We also started doing like writing everything from day one. I come from a process background, so I put processes in place in 5 seconds from the first day, and I think that's super important. So like for onboarding, we have like a Kanban board for onboarding, and one of the first steps that they do is definitely go through the branding foundation and the values. One thing I'll say though that we noticed, like it's important to reinforce that even after onboarding, because one thing during onboarding is that people get easily overwhelmed with so much information. Like they're going through so many things, they're meeting teammates, they're having onboarding, like technical calls, cultural calls, all of that. And I noticed from experience with some of the teammates we brought on, that they forget certain things, and it's not like intentional, or it's not because it was not well presented to them. So I think it's important to even like I bring sometimes, like the culture presentation from onboarding, I bring it during learning time in our whole company. So that way it's a good reminder for everybody to reinforce and talk about the culture again and again, and those things, those small things, and their importance and why we're doing them. I also tend to quiz them, like they tease me about it because like I feel you're a teacher, and I'm like, yeah, because I want to make sure it sticks, right? So it's like, why are we doing this? So why, like, what are the top 3 things that you remember from that what we talked about? Or why are we doing gratitude? Why is it important? Like, I don't want it to become just a habit. Okay, it's just a meeting we jump on every Monday, right? And that's easily can happen, especially as a company scales, as new people come in, and I can see that. So I think it's important from the top leadership, like to always, infuse their managers with that becomes really a core practice in everything that's done. Like even when we do performance reviews, or like always to bring the culture component, the reinforcement, as this is a practice you need to do with your team, and find, here are all the ways you could do it, and find the ways that work best for your team. So that's my 2 cents.
I agree. Yeah, I'll say that you brought up a great point on weaving culture into performance reviews, because oftentimes performance reviews just get boiled down to very simple metrics, but the cultural component of that is significant. If you spent a significant amount of your last year or half year contributing culturally and really reinforcing and living the values, that should count. And I think that oftentimes gets lost in the numbers driven society, where it really just gets boiled down to that. That's how culture begins to disintegrate. And so reinforcing that along the way, I almost see it as like a learning and development type of task, where people oftentimes go through HR training on an annual basis, cultural reminders of what was there. And so fresh and onboarding, but on a recurring basis, probably isn't a bad idea either.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah. Shall we go to the next question?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. So I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen at least, that with remote work, especially when you have junior people or people who left a regular office job to go into remote, they have a hard time understanding, what are working hours. Feel almost uncomfortable with flexible hours, and so work-life balance gets lost really quickly, and you find people really almost like all the time logged in, all the time working, and it's not necessarily delivering or being productive. It's just a matter of guilt, being fed by the fact that, oh, okay, I'm not feeling guilty, I'm sitting and working, type of thing. So how to ensure work-life balance in a remote team? That's really what I want to get to.
It's a great question. We're still learning. I'll say that studies have shown that companies with unlimited vacation policies, people actually tend to take less, which like is so counterintuitive. Like you can structure your year however you want to, but people are so afraid of actually taking advantage of it that they just end up not doing it. And so we at GitLab try really hard to make sure that's not the case. One thing that I've seen as an employee is executives living it at the top makes everyone else feel more comfortable about actually doing it and having a work-life balance or work-life harmony or whatever suits you. If your executive team shows no signs of having a work-life balance, then it's pretty difficult to expect that managers and direct reports would have that as well, because people generally tend to look to their leadership and then mimic that, because that is the culture. And I think culture even applies to work-life balance. So I think number one, it has to be lived at the top. Leaders cannot ever be quote unquote too busy to actually have a life, because there are a lot of people working under them that rely on the role model that they are for how they're going to act and how their life is going to live. One thing I would recommend is having a health check as a part of a weekly one-on-one or stand-up or however your company structures those. It should be a part of each managerial check-in to say like, hey, have you been able to take enough time off? Like, do you feel like you're encroaching burnout? Are there any concerns you have about a project that's just taking way too much mental energy compared to what you thought it would? Have you accidentally overcommitted? Things have just spiraled. These things happen. It's really easy to say yes to something, and then 3 months down the road, when this project is really big, you're thinking, wow, like this project in and of itself is a full-time job. I didn't know that at the time. Now I'm struggling to balance all of these other things. Totally real world situation. You need to create a culture where it's okay to say that in a one-on-one and not be negatively judged for it, because it's impossible to know everything. And part of what comes with a positive culture is people generally want to help others. So they're more inclined to say yes without really knowing what the outcome is going to be. And that comes from a healthy place. But if you do that too much and then things actually become much bigger than you had anticipated, you could end up in a situation where you have no work-life balance and you're burnt out, and it was all from positive intent. So you need a manager to be able to untangle that, figure out what the new priorities are, and give you some relief on that. I think it's a total case-by-case basis. We're learning on that every day. One other thing I'll point out that GitLab does that I think is really cool on balancing this is we have what's called a visiting grant. So it's an incentive where we'll partially reimburse travel if you go and explore and visit another GitLab team member anywhere in the world. And so there's a work element to it where you go and co-work with this person, but also it encourages people to leave the house, get outside of their comfort zone, go explore a new culture, go try new food, learn a new language, whatever it may be, and we're going to help support that and encourage that financially. So anything that you can do that helps a person get out, explore, do something that's not directly work related sends a really good message.
I think that's really great. One of the things for me, I want to kind of explore the stigma around like leadership being like the example, because I think that's very unrealistic to follow. And here's why. Like, for example, I take my example, right? I've always been the super busy bee before even this company, right? So I'm somebody who loves being busy, who loves working. And what I'm doing right now, like, I sincerely love what I do. So it's like when I'm talking to people or going, like, that's not work for me. That's literally the way I live. So if my team looks at me and be like, oh, look, Emna is working, like 18 hours or whatever, like, of course, we don't have the same type of job first. The second part is, I think, like, I feel almost depression on the other side. I'm like, but that's not what I want to do. Like, yeah, of course, I understand the importance of breaking and building the right habits. And I'm doing that differently, right? I'm managing my day differently. And because people are not here, what they might perceive as me working 18 hours might not be the case, but it's just their perception because I'm always, like on the go, I'm present, whatever. So I think the key point, I come again from a process and structure background, like I'm all about process, is putting process around things. So when you talk about unlimited vacation, that's absolutely true. All studies showed that in unlimited vacation, when you have unlimited vacation, people don't take vacation. So, but two things that I see work really well, because we have an unlimited vacation policy as well as a company, is one, being communicative about the fact that there is a minimum that needs to be taken, right? To be like, listen, if you want to take 2 months of the year or 3, we need to have structure around it. But you need to at least take, 3-4 weeks, or that's the minimum that you have to do. 1, 2. The second part is that being clear on the structure, because people, when you give them something with no structure or limit, they really don't know how to navigate it. So they'd be like, how can I take 3 months off? Like, that's crazy. That never happened. And for me, is to say, okay, here is the policy around long-term vacation. If you need 3 months because you decided to go tour the world, or, because you want extra paternity leave or extra, whatever that is, then we need to put structure around it. And that structure is in process and documentation. It's like, okay, so you're in marketing. So what are your main things? What can you document for the person who will take over to make sure everything is covered while you're gone? And these are the important things. So you don't have the guilt, the FOMO, being scared of screwing up type of situation. So, and I think by putting these type of practices in place, that's how you can help really reinforce an unlimited vacation policy. The other second aspect is I truly believe in the role of people operation manager. And this person in our team, like in any startup, they do everything, but like a core thing about people is to make sure that they're looking out for the rest of the team, including the leaders themselves, right? So like if they see somebody like, you know, they're gonna burn out, or like they're working too hard, or like then to make sure like to get a one-on-one with them, make sure that to do a check-in, a health check-in, to make sure they plan for vacation, for time off, and all of that. And if the company and the leadership really reinforces these two practices, I think there's definitely a great way to scale, you know, this work-life balance, you know, structure in any remote company. These are my personal 2 cents. So yeah.
No, I love that. I love that. I love the counter on putting process around it, because you're right. Something I may take for granted is, having worked remotely for a really long time, I've sort of learned to navigate some of the unwritten rules just because I have that experience. But if you're coming in fresh and there's no policy around it, your default is to just not do it or not engage with it because you're afraid of going about it the wrong way.
Yeah.
I really like that. And that definitely touches on transparency and documentation, on just being transparent about what is possible. And if someone brings up an issue, like to your point, if you wanted to go somewhere for 3 months and that's not documented, the next step for me would be, well, let's figure it out and document it. And we'll get a first iteration down. And if we realize that it's not exactly the best, we could just change it and evolve it over time as your company gets more experience with those different aspects.
Absolutely. So I think that's definitely very key. Cool. So talking about process and structure, let's talk about the importance of process optimization when it comes to productivity, because today, as we go remote, obviously we have even more information overload happening, because, you know, documentation is all over the place, and you get lost into it, and you have, you know, so many tools you're using, and it's hard to keep productivity going. And while FOMO is there as well, especially if you are in a co-located situation or like a hybrid situation, that's even harder. That's there. So you try to be on top of everything all the time. So what are some of the practices to ensure productivity and optimization of process, and make sure like your time is really spent well? What can you share with us?
Yeah, so at GitLab, documentation is essential. Everything we do from a process standpoint would not be nearly as efficient if we didn't document. We have a rule of the company that's handbook first. So your prior example was a great one. If someone wanted to take 3 months and that was nowhere to be found in the handbook, then the next thought would be, okay, handbook first. Let's solve this problem, document it in the handbook first, and then disseminate it through Slack or whatever it means. That way, if it's in the handbook, it's something that's searchable and culturally everyone knows, search there first. If a question comes up in your head, we're just culturally attuned to searching first in the handbook. And then only if we don't find it there would we ask somewhere else. And then if we found a new solution, we would then, of course, document it in the handbook so that anyone having that question henceforth would be able to find it there, and it would make their day more efficient. So documentation is key. I've seen companies use all sorts of different tools for documenting. We love and believe in our handbook. As it has grown, it's over 3,000 pages now. We actually have a person dedicated to managing the handbook now, and part of his role is going to be thinking through, is this really the best layout of information? Is this structured in the best possible way? Is it laid out in an efficient way? Can people actually find what they need to find? So I think as a team scales and more of that information becomes available, you'll have to ask and answer some of those questions just on a discoverability standpoint, because I don't think there's any simple answer to that. Depends on the company size, depends on the handbook size, that kind of thing. We try to think about process in every aspect of the company, not just engineering or technical, but even to your point with vacation. If you put process around everything, it's less questions and people can just easily find things. And it's just a great relief when you have a question, you know where to search and there's an answer there. I think the last thing I'll mention is transparency is key for all of this. To whatever degree you possibly can, try to answer these questions transparently so that the entire company has access to the answer. It just creates a much better, the situation around morale is just much more positive when answers are documented in a transparent way. And there are some legal bounds around revenue and things like that for private companies, but to the degree that you can, be transparent even when it's difficult.
I think that's so crucial, like transparency. And that's something we believe in even at Veamly, on all levels, even the difficult conversations, because, again, you go back to stress and fear and all these things. Documentation as well. Like, one of the drawbacks of documentation that we've seen, at least when there's so much going on, people like somehow go to Google first, and I'd be like, we have that in our documentation. So it's like, it's really a work in progress to help educate people. We're learning every day to be like, go back to our documentation, search our wiki, make sure like there's an information about that. Because I fell into a situation being remote and so many hours of difference, like somebody would be working on something for 3 hours and I'll be like, they already have one pager on that, right? And I think that's the hard part, at least going back to, our earlier fact in terms of like, is different from a tiny company to a bigger company. Like today, if you go to GitLab, like documentation is so obvious. It's like, yeah, we have that. We have a 3,000 pages handbook. But when you're a tiny company, you have a few hundred pages. So it's like, and people are still, are not used to small companies having this much process and documentation, because it's not common in startups. That's the reality of it. So that's one of the drawbacks. So for us, what worked and what we've seen working is big believer in lean and Kanban type of thing. So it's like when you put process around everything in terms of even like the way we do things. So it's like, you have like your task list for the week, but also you have a way to go through it and to know what are like the must like do. For example, like for our content marketing team, like what are the top things to check every morning that you have to go to, like your metric boards, like what like the pipeline for content, guest posting, all of that. And then you look at your weekly list and then you update that every week. And that way, even your remote manager or somebody on the other side of the world could look at it at any time and help adjust and iterate and like give you input. Asynchronously, I know we're going to go into that a little bit. That's something I know definitely want to discuss, but I think process in that sense beyond documentation is also very important, and continuous collaboration around it. So I don't know your thoughts about that.
Can I ask you, do you have anyone dedicated to documentation, or is it a shared responsibility across everyone on the team?
It's a shared responsibility. So
Yeah.
that's anybody, like the culture is like write things down type of thing. So whenever you have usually what happens is that we write when we feel, oh, okay, especially when people go on vacation or something, they realize they need to write more in that sense. But sometimes when people have some free time and they're like, let me write, a wiki page about this particular thing. The other part is when, you learn something new. Let's say like you watch a GitLab video today, like you learn something new about remote practices, then just, throw a draft out there and somebody else will come and contribute to it and add to it. But like, at least start the conversation around that particular topic.
Yeah, agreed. And we operate the same way. The handbook manager is actually kind of an overseer role where he looks at the technical aspects of it and things like that. But I've actually spoken with some other companies and have suggested that even at the earliest stage, if it's difficult for you to get the team to contribute and everyone write things down, consider hiring like a former journalist or somebody that has a strong editorial background that could be almost a documentarian or an archivist for the company at an early stage, and just try to document as much as you possibly can, because every day that you don't document is so much harder to do it after the fact. And so many little nuances get lost if you don't document when it's happening in real time. And that kind of like scares some people to like, oh no, I've already spun up a company. We're 2 or 3 years in. Is there any way to do it now? And like, of course, today is the next best day that you can start.
Yeah.
I mean, yesterday would have been great, but today works as well. And start getting that process in place. It's really easy to just say in a co-located space, hey, let's just get everybody in a conference room and just hammer out this thing. And then it's all lost in the ether. And so teams that are in different offices or people that weren't in the room or they were out sick or whatever, they have no way to catch up. And that's where the dysfunction starts to happen. And so mandating time to document, it feels like a burden at the time, but it actually makes everyone's life so much easier in perpetuity, really.
And that's why, like, for us, I mean, we try to keep track of everything. Like, so one of the things, for example, that we do that I want to change, so recording meetings when you do Zoom meetings, I feel like for me right now it's useless in terms of like nobody has the time to go watch something versus when we have new technology coming in that you can search voice and you can transcribe, but like for today this technology is still not great. So it's like, how can we make sure that everybody else, sees the information? And even if we're in co-located space, like, again, the culture and the structure of the company is built for remote. So, and that's, I think, is the best way. I believe in co-location. I believe that hybrid is not going to go away. I believe sometimes you can get the best talent, but they really don't feel comfortable with the remote. But to keep it flexible, even with that, like, offering co-working spaces, be like, you can just go and get together in that place, but that doesn't change the process internally as a company. And I think that's the best formula, to have a hybrid, so that nothing gets lost and there's no guilt, there's no FOMO, there's none of these really drawbacks of a usual hybrid situation, especially for big companies going into remote as a new practice. So
yeah, absolutely.
absolutely. One of the things I want to touch upon in this sense, in terms of productivity as well, is that even though you're documenting, as I said, like, there's still a lot of information overload. So people tend to send stuff on different Slack channels, or like comments on pull requests or on tickets, and it gets completely lost. So it's like, what have you seen in that sense, as challenges from that perspective, and ways to solve for that?
Yeah, it's the distribution of information far and wide is definitely a challenge. I'll say at GitLab, when we are working on a project and it's all internal, so there's no outside party that we're working with, we're really efficient at using merge requests and issues and the discussions that are allowed in those, to keep all of the discussion and documentation in that. So that helps us communicate in one place, and it's asynchronous, and you know where to go, and it's easily searched. Nothing gets sort of fragmented in Slack or fragmented in email. But that's a best case scenario. And as soon as you involve one external party that maybe they aren't signed up with GitLab, or they don't want to learn the platform or whatever, and they want to just default to email or carrier pigeon or whatever it may be, you end up with this fragmented array of information. And so we're definitely still grappling, I think, with like most companies, on if you get updates in various places, like an update came in on email and then it was shared over Slack, and then someone else opined on it, and then that update may have been translated into a GitLab issue, maybe not. That becomes challenging. So it's something that we struggle with, and I think a lot of companies do. Email is an archaic technology at this point, but it's unfortunately the only one that I think is universally accepted and recognized, and I think that's why people default to it. But it's really poor for transparency. It's really poor for sharing large files, whiteboarding, that kind of thing. It's not ideal. It's great for saying hey to a colleague, but it's not really great for managing a project end to end.
I absolutely agree. And beyond that is like like you said, every person has a personal preference in terms of what they like to use to communicate with. So I don't think we'll be ever in a world again, at least in this time, where we're going to impose one thing that everybody would use. And I know you're doing it internally at GitLab. You're trying to use GitLab for everything, which is great. But you know very well, even your customers, I'm very sure, like, they use GitLab and gazillion other things next to GitLab, right? Or they'd rather communicate. And that's very common usually for any collaboration app, that the founding company would use it perfectly, but then once it goes to the customer, you start seeing like really very different use cases. And that's literally like for us, like, well, that's the pain we saw even as a company. And what we're trying to solve for is like, how can you help people bring easily process and workflow around all their different apps, and make sure that communication is asynchronous, even if it in its top synchronicity type of thing. So if that's the correct word, but anyway, so the point is, thank you for sharing that. The last point, as we started already mentioning it, talking about the future being truly asynchronous, there's a lot of debate around it. I know I don't know if you know the Running Remote conference that happens in Bali every year. I mean, you know it, obviously you guys participate as a company. Love the founders, love what they're doing. And I know like this year alone, there was a topic about, synchronous versus asynchronous. Some companies still believe synchronous is the way. Personally fully believe that the future is asynchronous, and that's how we can best really take control of our time and make sure we're efficient, but also have a life outside of it. So tell me more about your thoughts as you at Darren, but also as a company about that.
Yeah, so asynchronous is essential to GitLab functioning. We have people in over 60 countries now, and I think that's only going to continue. And so almost every time zone in the world is covered. And so trying to wrangle people into one call or one meeting is inefficient. It just goes against our efficiency value. It's just not a war worth fighting. So async versus sync is definitely seen as a process choice for most people. But what we found interesting at GitLab is that it's actually a cultural element, and being fully asynchronous, it actually makes people, it improves morale. It actually improves well-being. And I think the reason for this is when you operate and think, okay, if I'm taking a project from point A to point B, and then someone else is going to pick it up and take it from B to C and so on and so forth. If you operate from the mindset of no one else is online right now, so how can I best encapsulate what I'm doing so that anyone in the company who picks this up will have a great idea of what my train of thought was to get to this point. If you're able to approach your work like that, it's less chaotic. It's the sense of urgency is not on you just need to get something out now. The urgency is on I need to do this and document it well so that wherever it's picked up down the road, it's understandable and can be taken to the next step. For me personally, that has helped with stress and anxiety. It's less about I need to be on from this hour to this hour. Because the truth is life doesn't work like that. Things in your life that are really important are going to spring up, curveballs are going to happen that you couldn't possibly anticipate, and they're going to happen within the core working hours of your day. And if you don't have an asynchronous culture and background, and you don't have a company that supports that, it's only added stress on how do I deal with life if it happens to come within the set working hours. Now, I get it. Not every company can do that. If you're in a manufacturing company, for example, where things have to happen in a very closely timed set of sequences, I get it. But if you're a digital company where you can enable async, I would recommend doing it. I think people respond well to it. Of course, people love to work synchronously if they happen to be online at the same time, but having the freedom to do it async and give people the power to work when they're most creative, they're a morning person, a night person, a middle of the night person, it's just a more inclusive way to work. It doesn't force people to do something in certain hours. Sure, there are challenges to it, but I think the pros outweigh the cons.
I so absolutely agree. Like one of the, I mean, yeah, of course it's not for everybody. It's like remote is still not for everybody. Like I still don't see how a manufacturing plant can be a remote company, right? Like, so absolutely. But there's definitely a huge side of the market that's all tech and digital. And there's already so much to be done there before we start thinking about all the other industries. And one of the things I always believed in is like whether you work 12 hours or whether you work 1 hour, what matters is the output, and nobody should judge you on how long it takes you to get that output out. And that's my core belief, and that's what I really try to push for everybody in our team, that's what really matters. So that being said, is that like with synchronous communication, the problem is it created this fake sense of emergency. It created this heavy interruptive environment, a lot of context switching, and then you end up, highly stressed all the time. Like very few people realize that stress is as bad for your liver as alcoholism is. Like a study showed literally that. So, and we don't realize it because now we are so used to our stress. Like we live with it, and we don't even know what a life without stress, without bad stress is. And I think by removing that aspect, by removing that interruptive effect, that's how we go into the future, because we cannot sustain as a humanity this way. We cannot keep up with it. We cannot keep up with, again, a fake sense of urgency. I always say, like, if it's truly urgent, people will call. That's usually what happens. Nothing deserves your attention right away, but yet your brain, when it sees something come in the screen, you automatically go to it and you find yourself engaging. And then like at a certain point, like self-awareness kicks in and you're like, what am I doing? Like, why am I not back to the task I was doing? And that's the part that where very few companies are really paying attention to it, but we're seeing more and more awareness. And that's like also our mission, like to make sure that people really see that and how bad it is and how asynchronous is really the way to go. And I love what you said about morale, because that's something personally I didn't have a comparison aspect to see, like, does this have an impact on people's well-being? So I love it. I'm going to use it going forward because it's really an amazing argument. Like if people feel better and happier and more comfortable, even more reason to do it.
Yeah, I completely agree that it's unsustainable. And I feel like I hope we're reaching a tipping point as a working society where we're just not going to accept any longer that this sense of urgency, like someone else's urgency has become my urgency and it's perpetual and it never stops. That's like life is more than that.
Yeah.
And a lot of the technology that has enabled remote work, part of the way that these technology companies increase engagement is to do things like notify you about everything, regardless of its priority level or its
Yeah.
importance. Because if those notifications keep coming, you're more likely to re-engage with them, which looks great from an engagement and a metric standpoint. And so to some degree, it's a self-fulfilling cycle that
Yeah.
happens on the technology that we use, where we're not stepping in as humans to say, is this really the best way to use it? Like, wait, this is a technology and a tool. We're the humans here. We should really figure out a sane, safe, healthy way to use it. And a lot of times tools just get implemented without that mental humanity check. And I think that's going to happen more and more. I think
Most of the time.
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say no, most of the time, absolutely. Most
Yeah,
of the time. And it's so funny because for me, I say, no, we're all about removing interruption as a company. And there are three kinds of interruptions, right? You have like your self interruptions where your mind just wanders. You have the physical interruption that remote is removing, right? Because like when somebody taps on your shoulder, and then you have the digital interruptions that are really huge. And but as a company, for me, like it's very important to educate the world beyond our software, beyond our product. And so we just started doing productivity workshops here in San Francisco in collaboration with the productivity coach. And as part of the things I tried to get people to do is to take the challenge of removing all their notifications from their phones and removing social apps as a start. And it's a very hard step to take. Like even personally, when I did that, I felt something was missing from my body, like literally for a couple of days. But yet now I feel so much more in control. I literally broke up with my phone as a device that controlled my life. Like for example, yesterday my phone was off for 6 hours. I didn't care because like I was doing something else. I was focusing on something. So it didn't matter. But to get to that state of mind is very hard because it's addictive. It's like a drug. Those notifications are like a drug. And whether it's work or even social. And the beauty of it is I had people recently who were part of that workshop. They're like, I removed notifications. And I was like, how was it? They're like, well, I don't know yet. But one thing I know is I started remembering what I was doing. Like so, that sentence was so powerful for me. It's like that's how bad those interruptions are for our brain and the way we work as a society in that synchronous environment. So
yeah,
anyway, I want to share that story.
for sure. That's a beautiful story, and I agree. Async removes that cycle of bad stress because when you're async, you're able to give yourself permission to decline the notifications and get into a state of flow about something that you prioritize. As a manager of one, if you prioritize this project as being the most important right now, you can do it on your time asynchronously and get it done in a way that is most suitable to you without the judgment of why isn't this person doing it within these hours. When async is company wide and it removes that judgment related to time, there is a dramatic increase in morale, a dramatic difference in how people see each other and that they appreciate people are taking time to ingest things in a way that works for them versus just some sort of hierarchy of urgency that's just being put in place by tools and notifications. um, I agree, and to your point about declining the notifications, it's bad that we've gotten to a place where we don't even remember what life is like without
Yeah.
those. But for viewers, I would really encourage you to do that. You're in control of your phone. You're in control of your notifications. And if you think otherwise, like the notifications should not be able to control you. And it's hard at first if you're addicted to them, but there's more life to be lived on the other side.
I think the most beautiful moment is when you realize that you're somehow feeling lighter, but you don't know why. And this happened to me. Like one time I did an update a few weeks ago on my phone, and somehow, I don't know if I did it over the update, like all my notification got activated again. And I lifted my phone and I literally had like a freeze. I was like, oh, what is this? Like, so, and literally I felt anxiety in my chest, and I realized how freeing it was to remove those, like, and how I still have stress. I'm human. Like, obviously I run a startup, so that's not simple, but you still remove that unnecessary stress that the digital world created for us and the synchronous world created for us. So anyway.
So thank you for joining me. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about Veamly. It sounds like you're developing a tool that helps with all of these things. So if any of our
Yeah.
viewers are interested in living a better life through process optimization, I'd love to have you talk a bit about that.
Thank you, Darren. So what we do at Veamly, like, we're all about helping software engineers really take back control of their time, which is most of what we've been talking about. We do that by bringing all of their collaboration apps like GitLab and Jira and Slack and everything, whatever they're using, in one centralized workstation. And then on top of it, we give them a smart inbox to help them process all of the inbound. The whole point is to help them use all these apps more efficiently and to create that workflow and process that will allow them to focus better on the task at hand. What we do as well is we help them see metrics about all of that, and we help them really truly be more proactive about their time, more intentional about it. I always say, like, I want people to treat their health the way they treat their time, the same way they treat their health, to start really noticing how well they're spending their time and be more intentional about it. So you can check us out at veamly.com. We have a lot of content also that helps with all these things we talked about in our blog, but also we have webinars where we invite also guests, and we're going to have actually one with one of the GitLab teammates in a couple of weeks, actually, with Mac, and who's going to talk about those productivity tips that they use at GitLab with their teams to help really form better communication and more efficiency. So yeah.
Amazing, amazing. Well, Emna, thank you so very much for joining me. I will be sure to put all of those links down in the YouTube description box. And if you're interested in learning more about GitLab's all remote culture, you'll find a link there as well. And if you want to join me and do one of these pick your brains, I love doing those. I'll put a link down below with the submission form. Thanks so much, Emna.
Awesome.
Appreciate
Thank you
it.
so much, Darren. Thank you so much.